Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and I'm here joined with Dr. James Greene. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing just fine, thank you.
Well, we have a good topic to talk about. We're going to talk about Harlan County. Dr. Greene, tell us a little bit about your Kentucky connection and that sort of thing, your connection to Harlan County.
Okay, well, I'm a native of Harlan County, and I've lived here most of my life. I was educated at Harlan High School, and then I went off to college, and I attended University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for a year, and then I attended University of Wisconsin in Madison, where I got my bachelor's degree. Then I got my master's from Union in Barberville, and then I got my doctorate from Ohio State. So, but I always intended to go, became a teacher, and I intended to come back to the mountains because I felt a commitment to work in the mountains. So that's why I ended up. And I taught high school classes for 17 years, and then the superintendent came and he convinced me that I could do administration, which I had never thought about. And I didn't know if I'd like it, but I thought, well, it won't hurt to try it, because at that point I was thinking I had just gotten my doctorate completed, and I was thinking I'm going to try to get a college job. And I started doing it, and this was right before Kara came along. And I was really interested in some of the potential for reform, and so I really got wrapped up in that, and I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed working with teachers and working on improving the educational program. And of course, Harlan Independent School District has done very, very well and has a pretty good record on the state tests and stuff. So, and I retired about 7 years ago, but I was there almost 50 years.
Wow. Well, yeah, that's a long time, and
I didn't intend to be quite as long as I was, because I had. It was really funny. I had gotten ready to, I thought I'm going to retire at the end of this year. And superintendent, it's right before spring break, I said, there's something I want to tell you. And he said, well, I got something I want to tell you. And I thought, what are you going to tell me? And he said, so he shut the door. He said, I'm going to take another job.
Oh,
said, well, this is really funny, because I was going to tell you, I think I might retire. So there was the guy who is now the superintendent. So I said to him, well, are you going to apply for this? And he looked at me, he said, well, are you going to stay? And I said, I tell you what, if you apply and you get it, I will stay for a year and help you out. Well, I ended up staying more than 1 year, but anyway.
well,
So I thought it came the day when I had to go and say, now, you remember I told you I was going to stay for a year, and I have stayed several years in addition to that. So.
Oh, well, me, I'm starting this is my 10th year of teaching. So, any good advice for to get to 50? That's a lot.
Well, I tell you what my philosophy of education is, and it's really funny. I believe very much that you have to teach the kids. That means that you have to figure out what the kid needs. Mm-hmm. And when I was in graduate school, my doctoral advisor, the late John Bellins, wrote on the board in a class we were taking, the learner is always right. Now, this was a class that's been taught in the evenings. So there's a whole bunch of Columbus public school teachers there, plus me, who is a former public school teacher. And we were looking at this, and it's like, what do you mean? The learner is always right? But you know, what that really means, and he explained it, and I really understand it, is that if the kid is not learning, there's something that's not right. Mm-hmm. And you need to look and figure out what that is. What is not right for that learner? What is it? Because if the kid's not learning, there's something going on in the kid's life. There's something in the way you're teaching, or there's something. Sometimes there's things you can't do anything about. You know, you can't. There's a lot of stuff you can't do about, as you well know, with the home situation sometimes. But there are lots of times in the way in the classroom, there's things that you just don't think about as a teacher, maybe, that actually, if you would stop and look at it, you might find there's a way to adjust. There's a different way to present material. There's a different way to engage the kid.
Mm-hmm.
And so I believe that we have to always be looking for that, how to teach the kid. And if you teach the kid, if you teach the same thing exactly the same way to all kids and to every time you teach it, then you've got a problem.
Yeah.
That's why I like it. I feel like, I guess that's one reason I stayed so long, because I feel like I learned to evolve. I learned to evolve in working with the teachers too, because I did a lot of professional development.
Mm-hmm.
You evolve, you learn and grow yourself, and when you stop doing that, then you don't need to be in the profession.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. That's some pretty good advice, I believe. So if you're a teacher out there listening, keep that close. Well, let's get into a little bit of Harlan County history. Just some basics here. It was the 60th county of Kentucky and named after Silas Harlan, who died on August 19, 1782, leading his party at the Battle of Blue Licks, which was one of the last battles of the Revolutionary War in Kentucky, which a lot of people don't recognize about, but we've done plenty of coverage on that on the channel if you want to find out more information. It borders Bell County, Leslie, Perry, Letcher, and Knox County. And Harlan County is the county seat. That's a good start, but what else as far as Harlan County do we need to educate the viewer about, or the listener about?
Well, let's talk a little bit about the geography just briefly.
Mhm.
And you really actually omitted something important when you said who the neighbors were. You told me the Kentucky neighbors were.
Oh, that's right.
Harlan County lies on the Virginia border. In fact, you can be in Virginia from downtown Harlan in about 15 minutes. So so we have to realize that Lee County, Virginia, Wise County, Virginia are also neighbors of Harlan County.
Well, we want to discourage anybody from going to Virginia. Stay in Kentucky.
Well, ideally, but actually, my personal feeling is that it would really be nice when they talk about roads if they would modernize the road between Duffield, Virginia, and Harlan County, because if they did, then we would have a straight shoot to the Atlantic coast through I-26 from Kingsport.
Oh, yeah.
It really, truly. I mean, we don't think about it sometimes that way. And actually there's a lot of people coming for tourism and stuff from the East Coast. So I think that, we don't want to discourage people, but we want people to come from Virginia to Kentucky, though.
Yeah.
If you think about this, though, Harlan County lies on that angle of the border of Kentucky, so that we're kind of on that line, that goes up that way. And so Harlan County is really dominated by mountain ridges that all run parallel to that Virginia border. And there are mountains on the other side in Virginia and Tennessee that run the same way. There's a whole series of mountains if you had a topographic map. And so in Harlan County on the Virginia border, you've got the Stone Mountain, Cumberland Mountain, as it's sometimes called. And then you've got, then the next row of mountains as you get into Harlan County, if you came from Virginia, would be the Black Mountain. There's Little Black and Big Black. Big Black, of course, is at the northern end of the county and is the highest. The top of Big Black Mountain is the highest point in Kentucky. Then across from the Black Mountain range, you have Pine Mountain, and Pine Mountain, of course, runs, I think, roughly 150 miles from Kentucky down into Tennessee. So it's a major mountain chain. And so between the Black Mountain Range and the Pine Mountain, you have the Cumberland River. And the Cumberland River has three major forks. The fork that comes in from the north running to sort of running from the north to the south at an angle, or east to west, actually northeast to southwest, is the Poor Fork. And then between the Black Mountain and Stone Mountain, you've got Clover Fork. And then you've got Martin's Fork, which actually runs along the state line, starts in Bell County and curves, heads sort of north, east, and then it kind of curves up to Harlan. And all three of these forks come together at the town of Harlan. And Harlan is almost in the center of the county. If you look at a map. Okay. Now, all of the water courses in Harlan County on the south side of Pine Mountain and towards Virginia are all part of the Cumberland River Valley. But the upper corner, the very top little tip of the county, there's one little section there that is in the Kentucky River Valley, and that is Greasy Creek.
Okay.
But most of the water course, the main water course on the north side of Pine Mountain, however, that runs down to Pineville is Straight Creek, and that is again Cumberland River. So everything's heading down to the sort of the southwest and goes into Bell County and takes us to Pineville. If you follow Cumberland River, you end up in Pineville, and then you're headed on towards Barberville and Williamsburg and whatever. So, it's really interesting because Harlan County is kind of, I don't want to say it's the backwater, but it's kind of the way it sits. It's between two major points, because if you get over there in Letcher County and you think about Highway 23 and stuff, and it takes you right up through Pikeville and on up to Ashland and all that stuff. So we're kind of in between these things, and the mountains kind of hem us in just a little bit. But it's really important to understand that the roads in Harlan County follow the water courses and the curves of the mountains. And for example, where I live, if you drove to the hospital from my house, it would be about 5 miles. But if you walked over the mountain, could hike over the mountain to the hospital, it would be about a mile.
Oh wow! Yeah.
I mean, I have hiked up to the top of the mountain and looked down. You could see the hospital. In fact, I live on what was my great grandfather's farm, and my great aunt told about when they were little girls that they go up the holler by the house. There's a little branch that comes in by my house, and they go up to the holler, and then they cross down and they go play with their cousins over there on the other side of the mountain. And then their mother wanted to come home. She just walked up to the top of the mountain and holler, and they'd hear her all the way down there. Which is, of course, this is the 19th century, so you can it's a little different today. But anyway. So I think that kind of, but that does impact. The other thing that's really important to understand about Harlan County is, of course, that we have a lot of natural resources, one of which is the most important of which is coal. But we also have timber, and Harlan County is largely forest. So of course, it's all second growth timber, pretty much, except there's some virgin forest, I think, in the Blanton, down at the Blanton forest. But those two resources in particular have been exploited over the years by Harlan Countyans.
Yeah. So, quick question about Black Mountain. Is it also called Caterin Mountain or something similar to that?
I've never heard it called that.
No. Oh, I read somewhere where the song Bloody Harlan, or You Never Leave Harlan Alive. It says it came down from Caterin Mountain or something like that. So I'd read that somewhere, but I didn't know for sure if that was.
Well, that's interesting because the creek that I live on is called Caterin's Creek.
Oh.
And it is a fork. It is a tributary of Martin's Fork. And it runs down and joins Martin's Fork, where 421 comes through Harlan, right south of Harlan. And so that might be a reference to one of the mountains in that area.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know. They'd be kind of curious. I'd have to go and look at the words of that. I don't recall it right off. Although I've heard the song, but
yeah. Well, anyway, that was a question I'd gonna spring on you there. But so what about say Native American presence and so forth in Harlan? What do we know? I know that it can be sometimes not as well documented or so, but what about I guess tribe and so forth?
Well, of course, if we really think about human habitation in Harlan County, we know from various archaeological findings over the years that there were people living in Harlan County several thousand years before the first European settlers showed up. We don't know a whole lot about some of these people because there are some sites, but they're not, there's not a whole lot of sites, and perhaps the most interesting of these prehistoric sites is the Indian mound that was at the center of what is now downtown Harlan. And we know a lot about this from the standpoint that in the 1830s, when they built a courthouse on that mound, they dug down about 8 to 12 feet and they found a bunch of human remains, and they wrote up a little bit about how they were buried, and they found a lot of artifacts. Whatever happened to that, I don't know. But then in the early 20th century, when they built some buildings on Main Street on that same part of that same mound, there was additional discoveries, but it was never excavated by professional archaeologists. So we're not really sure who built it. The leading theory, I think, currently is that it was built probably during the Woodland period, which is the archaeological period, by the so-called Adena people, and that's the archaeological term. We don't know what they call themselves.
Yeah.
But there is a possibility it was built by a Mississippian culture, some group associated with Mississippian culture. I'm not really up that much on archaeology. I'd like to learn more about it. I've been trying to get better informed about it. But I do know that there were people living in the valleys of Harlan County long before the Europeans showed up. However, in the period right before European settlers began to actually move in, pretty much there was no Indians that had a permanent presence in the county, because basically you had the Shawnees and the Cherokees who both kind of felt that they had some claim to this part of Kentucky. And so that you had groups that were hunting and regarded that as their hunting grounds. And so this, of course, would lead into some conflict with when the long hunters and the land speculators and all these other people started moving in. Now, there was a group of Indians, and I have not been able to learn a whole lot about it. And from what I can tell, I don't know that people know a whole lot about it. But in the late 19th century, a group of Indians called the Quadrille Indians that were living, I think, on Wallens Creek, and just about a handful of people. And I really don't, there's a lot of debate about who they were. And I'm not going to go into that because I'm not that well versed where I feel competent. I don't like to talk about stuff if I haven't researched it and I can document it thoroughly. I don't like all this. It's fun to hear myths and it's fun to hear stories about history. But if we're serious about history, then we want to have stuff that we can, as much as possible, document. So when I talk, I usually try to say stuff that I know that I could back up. And if I can, I'm going to tell you this is what people say, because it's a difference between what people say and what we can actually document sometimes. And sometimes it's sad because some of the things that people tell are the most colorful things in the world, and you discover they're not. It's a bit of truth in it as far as fact. So anyway, but one of the interesting things too, as we're talking about the Indians, is that Southwest Virginia, which is where most of the early settlers of Harlan County came from, that's where they were living when they moved to Harlan County. Southwest Virginia had a great deal of conflict with the Indians in the late 18th century, and mainly Cherokees. But there were also Shawnee parties that raided, and sometimes they like to go in, for example, and carry off slaves, which then they would take and sell, and some other things like that. But basically, most of that ended by the middle of the 1790s, because there were two treaties. There was a peace treaty with the Cherokees in 1791, and then one with the Shawnees in 1795. And it's interesting because there's a few little incidents with involves the very first settlers of Harlan County. So I'm thinking, who are these Indians that were doing this? Because the timing on it is kind of a little bit peculiar. But yet at the same time, there's clearly there were some incidents with the first settlers of Harlan County and Indians. So, and we might talk about a couple of those in a minute.
Yeah, well, and that kind of bridges it up pretty close to those first settlers, those first long hunters. One of those misconceptions that people often have was about Daniel Boone coming down the Cumberland Gap, but he actually came up through the Big Sandy and all that on the eastern part was his first trip into Kentucky. But just tell us some of those first long hunters. Who has that first European step into Harlan County, I guess.
Well, since you mentioned Daniel Boone, I'm going to tell a story about Daniel Boone, which I have never been able to actually prove. That I wish I could prove it because it's a good story. But supposedly there is a creek that is a tributary of Clover Fork up near that comes in at Everett's, and the creek is called Yoakum Creek. And there was a Yoakum family actually lived over in Southwest Virginia. And allegedly, and this according to the story, that Daniel Boone and this Yoakum guy were out hunting, and they were caught near the mouth of Yoakum Creek, and by Indians. And the Indians were debating about what they were going to do with them, which they were indicating they were going to tie them up and burn them at the stake, which the Indians very often did. And so Daniel Boone whispered to Yoakum, and so Daniel Boone leaped up on a tree stump and started crowing like a rooster, and Yoakum started scratching the ground like a hen, and the Indians thought this was real funny, and so after they watched that a little bit, and plus I think they also thought they might be a little bit crazy. So after they watched this a little bit, they decided instead of burning them at the stake, they were going to make them run the gauntlet. And of course, once they started running the gauntlet, they kept running.
Yeah.
Now I don't know if that's true, but now this story has been told and passed down, so I don't. It might be true. But anyway, in the 1760s is when you, of course, in Kentucky, generally is when the long hunters were active.
Yeah.
And one of the principal long hunters from the Southwest Virginia, Northeast Tennessee area of that period was a guy named Elisha Walden, which has become corrupted over the years to Wallen. And it's spelled in Virginia, it's spelled Wallen with an E in, and in Harlan County, it's spelled Wallen with an I in. So anyway, but they dropped the D. But anyway, and actually they spell that, the Wallens actually spell it Wallen sometimes themselves. But he led a group of long hunters, which the first group he led sort of skirted Kentucky, but then after that they came up into Kentucky. And so some of the people that penetrated Harlan County in that period would have been in that group. There was also a really interesting guy from Albemarle County, Virginia, and he had a white mother and a black father. And apparently the mother was married to a prominent fellow back over there. And so the white husband decided that he was going to raise this kid. But as soon as he turned 18, he gave him a gun and a horse and sent him on his way to the out west to make his way. And this guy's name was William Carr. And we know that he hunted in the area called the Brush, which included Harlan County. So he was one of the first long hunters that we know was probably in Harlan County. And then another really important long hunter who was in Harlan County was Joseph Martin and his brother Bryce Martin. And actually, they are the ones that started Martin Station, which was the jumping off point on the Wilderness Road for a period of time. And that is located in Rose Hill, Virginia, which is, almost on a straight line from Harlan and Wallens in that area of the county. So Martin's Fork is the fork that you would hit if you crossed from Martin Station into Harlan County. That is the watercourse you would hit, which then they would take down to penetrate the county. So that's where that name came from.
Okay. Now,
one of the interesting things too, I'm just going to throw this in, because sometimes we have trouble finding African American presence the way we want to. And Elisha Wallen had a slave that he took with him on his trips named Jake, and Joseph Martin also had a slave. I don't know his name right now. I think it's probably documented someplace. But it's kind of interesting because these hunters were bringing African American men with them when they were out there. But except for William Carr, their names are really not generally known in history.
Yeah.
But there are several different other people who were probably roaming around in Harlan County, and one of them left the name William WEA, which I think is probably, I think you're missing a letter because there was a Ware, the name Ware or Weir, W-E-R, and that might have been his name. I don't know. And a date 1769, but I have never been able to find anything else out about him. But we know that there were people in here that were exploring during that period. And one of the things that they were doing when they were hunting, they had 2 seasons. They in the summer and the early fall, they hunted deer. And they liked deer because deer skins were easy for them to pack. They couldn't really pack buffalo or bear very well, their hides. And then in the winter, they would hunt for smaller animals like beaver and mink and otter. So that's what that's the first use of Harlan County by people of European descent, was to the animal resources, the wild animal resources of the county.
Now, what about the McAfee brothers? Now, I probably should have disclaimed this first. The notes that I sent you are the notes from the Kentucky Encyclopedia, which you wrote in the first place. So I thought they would be pretty relevant for you. But you mentioned the McAfee brothers. Is that the same McAfee brothers that came to Harrodsburg?
It is.
Okay. Wow.
It is. Okay. In 1773, by 1773, you had this discussion about Kentucky, and James Harrod and his crew were beginning to think about going to Kentucky, which they did the following year, 1774, to make a permanent settlement. But the McAfee brothers decided, there were 3 of them, I think it was James, I believe it was William and Robert. Anyway, they decided that they were going to go down the Kentucky River, the Ohio River. They went down the Ohio River to the mouth of the Kentucky. Then they went up the Kentucky River to see what they could find, and they got off on the Salt River, and they ended up in what's now Mercer County. And so they spent a little time that summer picking out stuff that they wanted, land that they wanted, and they brought a guy with them too who was a surveyor for Virginia, and he actually was not really part of their party. He traveled with them part of the time. But anyway, so he was recording some of this stuff so that they were going to be legal whenever they got a chance to do anything. But they decided that it might be easier to get back to Virginia if they would just go straight on up the Kentucky River, which they did. And they went up as far as Leatherwood Creek. And when they got up there, they began to realize that this was not as easy as they thought it would be. But of course, if you go up Leatherwood Creek and you can cross over Pine Mountain, you would come out around Cumberland, which is, of course, in Harlan County. And so that's what they did. And they came out near the mouth of Cloverlet Creek, which is where Southeast Community College is located. And so this was in the second week of August in 1773. And by that point, they were about out of food, and they were really desperate. And they were just about ready to throw it in. And then they lucked up and were able to kill a deer. But they went up from Cloverlet Creek. They went up Cloverlet Creek, and they were heading up Black Mountain. So, and of course, that's close to the top of Black Mountain. So they wrote in, they kept a journal, and they wrote in the journal that they were in the worst mountains they'd ever seen in their lives. And they really thought they were godders. But anyway, they managed to get over the Black Mountain, and they camped on the head of Clover Fork, and then the next day they crossed over Stone Mountain, and they came out in Virginia. And but I think it was 2 or 3 days after that before they actually ran into anybody. But that is the first documented incursion of anybody in Harlan County where you can find a document, because they kept these journals. And then, of course, that family distinguished itself in Kentucky history because they came back and they did settle in Mercer County, in that area. And so, if you look in the 19th century, there's several members of that family who really distinguished themselves, particularly in education and religious activities.
Well, that's a lesson learned. Sometimes it's not as quick as the bird flies. I can only imagine them getting so far and then like, oh my, look at these mountains.
Well, they were kind of courageous, actually, if you think about it, because they didn't know for sure what the geography. At this point, a lot of that was really, and they were really explorers as well as hunters, or in this case, they wanted land. So, and of course, it's really interesting because Silas Harlan was in James Herrod's original party.
Yeah.
And he was, at that time, 21 years old. And his brother came with him, who was 19. They were young guys. And so they ended up settling near the McAfees, actually, because they settled in that same general area around Danville, near Danville, and Harlan Station that they created. And of course, that family went on to become very distinguished too, because we have two Supreme Court justices of the United States, John Marshall Harlan, and then there was also a younger John Marshall Harlan in the 1950s and 60s. So we have this connection with Silas Harlan, for whom, because of course he did not have any children. They would have been his several times great nephews. But we have these interesting connections with Central Kentucky.
Yeah. And that's it's funny when you start getting into county names. There's a lot of counties named after people who never set foot in Kentucky. But then there's those people who actually were in Kentucky and helped form Kentucky and so forth. And then you actually get there's a few out there that the person who the county is named after actually lived in the county that it's named after. There's not many. There's only like 2 or 3, I believe.
Well, one of the things about Silas Harlan, because when I was teaching, my kids always thought, well, Silas Harlan must have been the first settler in Harlan County, which I said, no. I said he was a big hero because he also was involved in George Russell Clark's Illinois campaign, and he was involved in all those major campaigns in the Revolution. But the only time that I know for sure that Silas Harlan had to come across through territory that would one day bear his name was when Herod's people left in a hurry because of the onset of Dunmore's War. And they went out through the Cumberland Gap. And so, of course, the Cumberland Gap, when Harlan County was originally created, the territory around Cumberland Gap was in Harlan County. So Silas Harlan did cross through territory that one day is bear his name, but it's just not the part that bears it today. But there is a possibility, because they did have scouts, and he did at one point scout in the mountains of southeastern Kentucky for Indians. And so it is possible that he could have actually been over in other parts of Harlan County. Yeah. But they didn't have any way of recording any of that and saying, oh yeah, we were at Harlan or Lowell or Everett or all that kind of thing. But it is interesting, because I have found in Revolutionary War pension statements a number of guys who were stationed in the different little forts in southwestern Virginia who scouted for Indians in Harlan County and Bell County, in that area. They in other words, they were sent over the mountain to go see if they could see any. They were very concerned about the Shawnees coming down from. Yeah. So that was actually part of the activity that was going on. The decade after the Long Hunters, you had this decade where there was some of that kind of stuff going on. And then from that, I'm trying to get us back on track here a little bit. Not away from the settlers. The 1780s are interesting because there were apparently some attempts made to settle in Harlan County. And I know that I told you I live on Catern's Creek, and there was a guy named Catern who's built a cabin at the mouth of the creek. Unfortunately, Indians killed him and his son, and they were buried there. Because they might very well have been the first permanent settlers otherwise. But there also is a story about a young girl who was scalped by the Indians and lived, and her name was Fanny No, and her family also lived on Catern's Creek. And the Indians decided to play tricks on them, as they would go in and do things like they would cut the threads on the loom, and the mother would blame the children for doing that and all this stuff. And then one day the father was gone, and the Indians came in and they killed the mother and the children. And they scalped Fanny, who was one of the ones that was scalped, but she managed to crawl away. And she was only like 3 or 4 years old. Wow. She managed to crawl out of the cabin because they set it on fire. She managed to crawl out and hide in the bushes. And they said about 2 or 3 days later that some of the other people in the area came in and discovered this. And she wouldn't come out for a long time because she was afraid they were the Indians.
Yeah.
back.
Wow.
But she lived to be an old woman. And this is a story that's been handed down in Harlan County history. It's probably she's probably the most famous Indian victim as far as the stories that have been told. But there were a couple of others because Elisha Wallen's brother Tommy and some other guys were hunting and down on what is now Wallen's Creek, and they were attacked by the Indians, and all but one of them, there were about 7 of them, were killed, and only about one of the party actually survived. So there were a few incidents of violence of that sort. And of course, there's also, if you think about the violence, Harlan County had wild animals. And when I say wild animals, I mean there were panthers.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I mean, the same. Because the panthers are really basically an eastern form of the cougar.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so these panthers were all over this area. Wow. And there's all kinds of panther stories, not just in Harlan County, but in other eastern Kentucky counties. My great-great-grandmother, who lived on the property that I live on now, but she went down to the creek one day with one of her children. This was probably in the 1840s, and she realized that there was a panther following them. So she had heard that if you looked the panther in the eye, it wouldn't attack you. Uh-huh. So she put her daughter behind her, and she walked backwards all the way back, which is a good distance. So it's probably like 600 or 700 feet at least, back across this field, with her daughter leading her. And as soon as they got in the house and closed the door, the panther leaped on the door. So, but I heard a number of stories, very similar stories. My wife's family had a story like that from Whitley County. So that was. But anyway, the name Benham is supposedly, there's several different stories about Benham, but there was a guy named John Benham who came from Maryland, and he is the one that brought the famous Benham apple to Kentucky. But anyway, or to Virginia, Southwest Virginia, and then it came over to Kentucky. But anyway, some member of his family was hunting in Harlan County and was killed by a panther. And his companion buried him, I think, on the foot of this mountain there at the side of what is now Benham. That's one of the stories. There's, there's a lot of these name stories. There are different versions of them. So
did the panthers get hunted out?
I guess eventually they did.
Yeah.
And the same thing when there were wolves, which is hard for us to imagine today. But the state had bounties on some of those. There were bounties on some of those animals. In other words, if you brought a skin in, you could get money. And so by the middle of the 19th century, like the wolf population had been greatly almost decimated. And then the fox population also been, my understanding is, diminished greatly. And of course, the other thing that you have to think about is that when Samuel Howard, who was one of the first settlers in Harlan, came in one morning, I think he was allegedly killed 7 bears in one morning. Well, by the beginning of the 20th century, you'd be lucky if you found 1 bear in Harlan County. And because there was a story in the Enterprise from 1909 where he was talking about this guy who killed a bear, and they were all like, "What?" Of course, today it's the other way around because we have bears in our garbage all the time. So yeah, bears are a problem, and they're fairly frequent compared to what they used to be. No, it really is. It's not really funny because it's become a real nuisance for people. Yeah. And there is a certain amount of danger because they can be very destructive, and you certainly would not want to be out there when they were prowling in your garbage.
Yeah, I have a pretty wild bear story too. We'll save it for later, but it was in Pigeon Forge. We're going to pause right there with our discussion with Dr. James Greene about Harlan County, and we're going to continue next week. So again, thank you to Dr. Greene for joining us, and thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you, the viewers, the listeners. We want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.